Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Conflict in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo has ebbed back and forth in recent years, but a push by the Rwanda-backed M23 rebel group has brought back memories of the very worst of the conflict in the 1990s. Nearly 3,000 people are estimated to have died in just under a week. Though fighting has slowed down slightly, the M23's continued advance in the DRC has raised fears of a broader war between Congo, Rwanda and their respective allies. We're joined by Michela Wrong, a veteran correspondent to the region, who's also leading our tour to neighbouring Uganda in June. Hello and welcome, Michela.
Good evening.
Thanks very much. We're going to discuss why now and what might happen next. But just to start with, can you just tell us what's happened in the last week or so?
Yes. Well, basically, the conflict, the fighting by the M23, this rebel group of mutinying soldiers who are from the Congolese Tutsi group, actually started 3 years ago, but it's been getting more and more serious. And the amount of land that they control has been getting larger and larger. And we saw a real escalation taking place just after Christmas, in which peace talks had failed, and they kept gobbling up more and more territory, and people kept, the international community kept announcing and asking them to stop, but they didn't stop, and eventually they were in a position where they were really on the doorstep of Goma, the regional capital of North Kivu. And last week, they went in, and they went in with very active and obvious support by the Rwandan army. I mean, for a long time now, people have been saying, there really isn't any debate about the fact that the M23 is linked at the hip with the Rwandan army. And so you saw Rwandan soldiers coming in across the land border between Goma and a town called Gisenyi, which is on the Rwandan side, and the M23 coming from the other side, from up along Lake Kivu. And what we're beginning to see now, because, it seemed a fairly painless capture of a major city, a big city, up to sort of 2 million people living there. And I think now we're beginning to see that actually it was pretty nasty. There are a lot of bodies. The UN has been talking about 2,800 to 2,900 bodies. A lot of them are civilians who were killed by shrapnel fire. The hospitals are full, overwhelmed by patients. And we saw a particularly nasty incident at the prison. There was a prison that was set fire to. The M23 surrounded it, let out the inmates. And it's not entirely clear what happened, but it's what it seems that the UN thinks that the inmates ended up attacking the women inmates who were in a separate wing, raping a huge number of them, and then setting fire to that part of the prison, so that a lot of them died in the fire. So a particularly brutal and horrible incident. The M23 have staged rallies in Goma, trying to reassure the local population that their intentions are perfectly reasonable, they're Congolese patriots. But a lot of what they say is sort of undercut by their actions. So, for example, they had announced a ceasefire, and the ceasefire didn't stop them continuing to fight. And having seized Goma, which is up in the north, they are heading down south towards the capital of southern Kivu, which is a town called Bukavu, a very beautiful town. And they're heading down there, and they've just captured a place called Nyabibwe, which is a mining town which produces a lot of gold and a lot of coltan. So they're said to be about 100 kilometers away from Bukavu and steadily heading there. And I think the concern is that if they seize, yes, thank you for that. Nyabibwe is where there's that little promontory sticking into that's around there. That is sticking into the lake. They're around there, so they've gone more than halfway down to Bukavu in the south. And if once they get to Bukavu, you can see that these are the two main land crossings into Rwanda from Congo. So they would control basically all the sort of trade between the two countries, because they're mountains to the north and to the south. And also there are the international airports. There's one at Goma and there's one in Bukavu, and they would also be controlling those airports. We know that they're Burundian troops massed at Kavumu, which is a little bit north of, there's an airport, the airport to Bukavu is up there, and the Burundian troops that have been massing there. We also know that if you look at Bukavu and then move to the east, there's a place called Ruzizi. I'm not sure you can actually see it. There's a river called Ruzizi, and it divides, Changugu, the town, is on the Rwandan side of the border. Ruzizi is the river that separates them, and apparently there are Rwandan troops massing there. So it's quite clear that the M23, with Rwandan support, they're aiming to capture Bukavu. And I think, ceasefires or no ceasefire, everyone knows that that's on the agenda.
So let me just interject briefly, and our thanks to Google Maps for showing us this conflict zone. Ostensibly, what do M23 say that they want? And we'll come to Rwanda in a second.
Ostensibly, they say they're there to protect Congolese Tutsis. There's a community from the Tutsi ethnic group. The Tutsi ethnic group straddle several countries. They live in Congo, they live in Burundi, they live in Rwanda. And obviously, they were the targets in the 1994 genocide of the Hutu majority in that country. And they, many Hutus were slain during that genocide, but they were the sort of key target. The RPF, Paul Kagame's rebel movement that seized power at that time, was dominated by Tutsis. So Tutsis living in Rwanda were seen as sort of fifth columnists, and they were targeted for elimination. So the M23 has long said that that the Congolese Tutsis living in Congo, are in danger of genocide because there are many of the extremists, the Hutu extremists who fled Rwanda after the genocide, operate inside Congo and have armed fighters who work alongside and cooperate with the Rwandan army. And they're there to protect this community from a second genocide. That's a sort of rationale and a narrative that most analysts reject, because the real reason why a lot of Congolese Tutsis are being targeted now in Eastern Goma is because the M23 is active and people feel beleaguered and attacked and have been invaded, and they've lost their property to the M23.
By a Rwandan-backed force. By a
Rwandan-backed force. So obviously it has made life these Tutsis extremely difficult.
I do want to talk about geography, just briefly, where we've got the map here, geography and minerals. I mean, we're talking about, and if you're talking about the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is enormous. Yes. And the capital, Kinshasa, is how many miles away from this zone, from this area?
I looked it up the other day, and the map told me 2,600 kilometers. Sometimes you see people giving a lower estimate than that. But it is, as you can see, they're on they're almost on the two extremes of Congo. Yeah. So you've got Kinshasa, it isn't on the coast, but it's on that side of the continent, and Goma is.
So in strategic terms, you could understand why such a big country might find it difficult to deal with a conflict so far away. I'm just in very simple terms.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Goma is a very long way from Kinshasa. There are certainly times when people in Goma feel that Kinshasa has completely forgotten about them and doesn't really care what's happening to them. And even if Congo didn't have a lot of problems, managing to muster a decent army, you can see that protecting those national borders, which have 9 neighbouring countries, is quite a challenge. And certainly Congo has not been up to meeting that challenge ever in its history.
Yeah. So the DRC, huge, home to enormous mineral wealth, and that's really the rub of this conflict, isn't it? This is where things are interesting.
Yes, I don't think it's the only reason, but it's definitely one of the reasons why Rwanda and Uganda in the past as well have seen fit to send their armies into neighbouring Congo, because often those interventions were for security reasons, but once they were there, they sort of realised there was a lot of money to be made. If you look at that map, firstly, these two provinces are North Kivu and South Kivu. It's worth remembering that they're very fertile areas. They're the sort of breadbasket of Congo. They're huge herds of cattle that graze there. There used to be quinine plantations. This is a breadbasket. It's a very rich area. But apart from that, there are also deposits of coltan, which is the product we use to make our phones and our computers and our EV vehicles. There's also gold, really large gold mines. There are tin mines. And then if you head a bit inland and then you end up sort of in the center of Congo, you start getting diamond deposits. So it's a sort of area that appeals to neighboring countries who, once they sort of established in the 90s that they could walk into Congo and they wouldn't meet much resistance. I think that's a habit they've both found quite hard to drop.
Okay, we need to talk about Rwanda. I mean, I suppose the surprising thing here is that really for a very long time, Rwanda has been the West's darling. It's been a major aid recipient. Kagame's government was seen as, ordered, perhaps not very democratic, but, it was a well-run country doing amazing things for business. And it was therefore a healthy place to send lots and lots of aid. Yet at the same time, at the moment, Rwanda doesn't seem to be actually disguising much. Kagame is actually making explanations as to why that Rwanda has a long-term territorial claim to this. So there's actually now little to hide in terms of what Rwanda's ambitions are.
Yes, he's yet to come out and say openly we're there. And we're proud of it. But we have seen a sort of shifting narrative, because originally Kagame would always say, no, we're not there. This is complete make-believe. We're not there. We're not there. And the UN group of experts who study the area and go and sort of do all sorts of surveys kept saying Rwanda is not only there, it's arming the M23, it's providing it with equipment, it's also clearly directing the M23's military tactics. And you can see that in the photos. Whenever you used to see photos of the M23 taken by Western journalists, you'd always be thinking that looks like a regular army, very well equipped, very well uniformed, very neat, very neat and tidy. And I think, yes, recently what you've seen over recent months is that the emphasis by Paul Kagame has been less to say, no, we're not there, although nominally he still does say that, but it's more to say, well, there are reasons why what happens in Congo matters to us. And then he will talk about the Congolese Tutsis being in threat and the sort of relationship between Rwanda's Tutsis and Congolese Tutsis. But the other thing he's been taken to recently, and I don't think this is at all credible, but I notice that he's saying it more and more often, is he says, that this group of extremists who are known as the FDLR, represent an existential threat to Rwanda. And therefore, if the Congolese won't deal with this group, and in fact, if their army insists on going into operations with them by their side, then that's an existential threat, and that threat cannot be ignored. I don't think anyone believes that, because Rwanda's army is amongst the most impressive and one of the best armed and most disciplined in Africa. But I've noticed that there's this is a recent emphasis you hear in his speeches.
I mean, presumably his army's had some Western training by the sounds of it, and I'm wondering whether the French have had a bit to do that as well. Why doesn't anyone have the leverage to pull him back? And what have they done previously?
Well, I don't think they have wanted to pull him back. The international community, in many ways, feels it is beholden to Rwanda. I think originally the fact that Rwanda had gone through this horrific genocide meant that there was a huge sympathy card that could be played. And, everyone felt, well, if he's a bit of a repressive authoritarian leader, that's a dangerous part of the world. And, his community was nearly wiped out in genocide. You can understand if he's not Mr. Liberal. But then there are sort of a series of ways in which Kagame has made himself very, very much treasured and valued by the West. I mean, here in Britain, we were proposing this time last year to send our unwanted asylum seekers to Rwanda, and a lot of African countries were approached and asked if they would do that by the British government, and they were not interested, but Rwanda stepped up to the plate. The French rely on Rwanda to police. They have a very large liquefied gas installation in Mozambique that that had to be closed down because of jihadi activity. The Rwandan government agreed to send peacekeepers to surround that area, and everything has gone very quiet and calm there since that happened. The Central African Republic, which is a former French colony, has also been pacified by Rwandan peacekeepers, so they're beholden to Rwanda. And the states, I think, in the big picture, feeling on the states was always this, this is an authoritarian leader, but we're very worried about jihadism in Africa. And, Paul Kagame is one of the few people who can really send peacekeepers at the drop of a hat. He can send his troops to act as peacekeepers in a lot of countries where it looks like jihadi activity is in danger of toppling governments around, particularly Western Africa. So again, the Americans have been very forthright in what they say, but they've taken not very much action. So I think there's a whole load of sort of self-centered interests that have meant that people have played it fairly soft when dealing with Paul Kagame.
While we're on this, I'd love you to talk a bit about the EU's agreement with Rwanda to supply essential minerals, and I wonder whether that could be seen as adding fuel to the fire.
Yes, that was signed, I think it was last year. And I know that I was astonished by it, and so were a lot of analysts were. And it was all about securing flows of these key minerals that everyone needs now for our sort of electronics and our high-tech industries. It has to be said the EU in its defense would say, well, we had also signed a similar deal with the Congo. But I think to a lot of people, outsiders, it looked like they were basically giving their blessing to the fact, which everybody knows, which is the reality that a lot of the minerals that Rwanda exports are not Rwandan minerals. They come from Congo. And you saw yourself from the map how easy it is to export minerals from Congo, Eastern Congo, out via Rwanda or via Uganda. And so the feeling, was that the EU was giving that its blessing in a very either a naive or a very cynical way. So I don't think that was at all helpful. I think the EU has given out a lot of very unhelpful signals to Rwanda. Another thing that it did very controversially is it decided to give a grant, 2 grants, in fact, to the Rwandan army to help it deploy in Mozambique around that gas installation that I was talking about earlier. And that seemed to me very, very stupid. I mean, if I can just put it that bluntly, because, the idea was it was supporting Rwandan army activity in Mozambique, but it was very obviously the same army that was busy interfering and crossing the border into Congo. And we know that, Kagame, he's constantly circulating his generals and his commanders between one battle ground field and another. So how you can help the Rwandan army in Mozambique without actually supporting the army that is invading a neighbouring country in the Great Lakes, I really don't know. But I think the EU has been very, very, very naive. And I think in that naivety or that cynicism, whichever way you want to see it, France has definitely played a key role and not a helpful one. And the country that's been trying to kind of put a brake on this is actually Belgium, which is the former colonial power in both Congo and Rwanda. And I think in Belgium, politicians feel very strongly that Paul Kagame is destabilizing this very turbulent, conflict-hit region. What he's doing is not helpful.
I'd love to talk in a moment about how this could deteriorate further. and if we can talk about some of the difference of partners, allies on different sides. And I know it's complex, so we'll try and keep it fairly simple. But please, can I get questions, people? If you're listening in, please do put your question in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. It might be elsewhere, or just raise your hand, and then we can promote you as a panelist, and you can put your questions directly to Michela. So just before we talk about the risks of contagion and this spreading, can we talk about who is involved? The UN is involved. There are South African troops there. I think Malawi's just pulled its troops out. Uganda's got troops there. There's a sort of, and then there are, not to mention the different militias within the DRC.
Well, I think this is precisely why people are so worried about what's going on, and why I spent the last week, doing TV and radio interviews, because people are really worried about the potential that it can escalate. Already, the Burundi army is already involved on the Congolese side. They already have troops inside Congo waiting. They're braced for the M23 to.
And why do they support the Congolese side? Why is that?
Well, there's never been any love lost between the Burundian president and Paul Kagame. In fact, the Burundians have accused Paul Kagame of trying to topple the Burundi regime, and giving safe haven to a group of coup plotters who tried to overturn the previous regime and fled into Burundi. So they see a potential attack on Congo as eventually a potential attack on them. It looks like Uganda is already getting involved in some way, although in what capacity isn't too clear. They have been, like Rwanda, they've intervened in the past and gone heavily into Congo and played a role in toppling President Mobutu Sese Seko of what was then called Zaire. So they've got form. No one knows quite what they're up to this time around. We've got the Malawian army in the role of southern peacekeepers, part of a southern African peacekeeping force. They have said that they're going to pull out. I don't think they have yet, but they've already said they want to pull out. The South Africans are there. They've taken, quite shockingly, for a peacekeeping force, they've already lost 14 soldiers, and apparently can't get the bodies out. And this has been a very humiliating experience for them, because, they're a far bigger and richer country than Rwanda. And yet there they are, finding themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned and humiliated by a rebel force supported by this tiny little state, Rwanda. So they're there. Then we also have a UN force, MONUSCO, which is one of the biggest and it's the longest running UN force, I think, in the UN's history. It's been there for decades now. They have sort of, had to accept that they are now, they were propping up the Congolese state, but they're now in Goma, and Goma is now in the control of the M23 rebels.
So that's where the UN was headquartered, where many of the UN agencies were headquartered in Goma.
It was where the international airport was. It was where the UN MONUSCO base was. So who else have I missed out? There's Congo, of course. They're involved.
And a rebel Congolese group that wants to get all the way to Kinshasa, possibly. And
the M23, which is saying, we want to march to Kinshasa. Oh, I forgot one other country, Tanzania, which is also part of the Southern African peacekeeping group. So it's a lot of players. It's a lot of people who have been taken by surprise and didn't see this coming, and it has the potential to escalate. And I think that's what keeps people awake at night.
And what's the view of the US administration? I mean, I can imagine in previous years, if it was Barack Obama and a time where the United States felt more influential and powerful, it would say, look, this has got to stop, and you've got to bang heads together, and we're going to withdraw military aid. Some of this has already happened, but it hasn't had much impact.
Well, 10 years ago, we were in a similar scenario. It wasn't quite as serious, where the M23, in a former iteration, was on the edges of Goma, and I think they actually went in. And at that stage, all the Western donors to Rwanda got together, and so did the World Bank. Obama called Kagame, and they basically said, you've got to stop this nonsense, just stop it right now. And they froze $240 million worth of aid. And Rwanda is a very aid-dependent country. It's small and it's poor, despite the fact that it helps itself to the minerals next door. So when that happened, amazingly, miraculously, the M23 dispersed in a couple of months. Its fighters went back into Rwanda and Uganda, whence they had come. And I think, we haven't seen that kind of united response this time. And Kagame is acutely aware of that. I think the States in particular has been absent without leave for very obvious reasons. We all know what's happening in Washington and how, the whole world's attention is focused on that process. And I think Kagame probably saw that coming and thought this is a good time to act, because nobody will have the oxygen or the headspace to deal with Congo.
Yeah, and the military aid had been suspended earlier last year, and the actual USAID program, obviously scrapped by Trump at the moment, or suspended.
Oh yes, all global aid was scrapped. It wasn't directed at Rwanda, so everything's now up for grabs. USAID may no longer exist, as far as I know. I think there had been a cut in military aid, but it wasn't that significant before by the US. So in a way, the US sort of weren't part of the debate anymore. And I think that timing was not coincidental, but that's the moment where Kagame decided to go in.
We'll take a question from Diane Cook in just a second. We'll promote Diane so that she can put a question to you. It really does raise the question, what does Kagame want? Minerals is one thing to boost your economy, but it seems to be, one hell of a thing to launch an all-out war, which could cause an enormous conflagration, bring all your neighbours in. What does he get out of this? I
think I always see Kagame as a big president in a small country, that Rwanda's too small for him. And you have to think this is a man who was part of a rebel movement in Uganda as a young man in his 20s that overturned the Ugandan regime of the generals who were running the country at the time. He then was part of a rebel group and one of the sort of key founding members that toppled the Rwandan regime of 1994. Juvenal Habyarimana. He then, his rebel forces and his forces supporting a rebel group that basically had been set up in Rwanda invaded Congo, as Zaire as it was then called, and toppled Mobutu. They then fell out with Mobutu's successor Laurent Kabila and tried to do away with him, but that attempt kind of turned out to be more than they could handle. So I think that chutzpah and gumption and a sort of willingness to do what no one else thinks is possible has characterized his career since the start. I think the Rwandans feel that they are cleverer than everyone else and that they can work miracles. Certainly in a militaristic sense, they can do things that nobody else would have thought was possible.
A man with a role to play in history, a sort of Napoleonic-like figure.
Definitely, he sees himself as one of the African leaders that are moulding the continent, and he's right. I just happen to think he's doing it in a particularly destructive way, but lots of people are great admirers of his.
Yeah. Let's have some more questions, please. Do put more questions down or just raise your hand. Let's take a question from Diane Cook, who's here in the UK.
Michela, the government in Kinshasa seems to be really conspicuous by its absence. I know it's 2,700 or 2,500 kilometers away, but what interests me is what external actors are supporting the Kinshasa government, if any?
Yes, thanks, Diane. Well, in theory, we have an aid program in Congo, the British government, the US does as well. The EU also had signed a minerals deal with Kinshasa. It has ambassadors all around the world. But I think there's a very, when you meet diplomats, they will always express how difficult it is to do business or to talk strategy or to talk politics with the Congolese leadership. And then they will say, and when you go to Kigali, it's completely different. You get a 3-hour meeting with Kagame, he sees you immediately, you talk Turkey, everything is agreed, it's fantastic. When they go to Congo and they talk to Kinshasa, they go to Kinshasa and they try and talk to Felix Tshisekedi, the president there, they're kept waiting till 2 a.m. If they're lucky, they get to meet the president. They don't really know that he's taken in anything they've said. Nothing seems to happen as a result of those meetings. And I think what I've seen over the years, and it was the same under the previous presidents of Congo, that there's a sort of exasperation at the chaos and anarchy and corruption and incompetence of the Congolese government, which means that, again, that there's a whole kind of raft of diplomats who find it just much more conducive to work with Kagame, who is known as the man who gets things done. So there are those relationships, but I think they are weak relationships. And one of my concerns is that if you go to Kinshasa, now I was there year before last, people are increasingly, Congolese population is increasingly disillusioned with the West, particularly with the Americans, and more and more instinctively pro-Russian. I mean, you have to remember that the first elected prime minister of Congo, was Patrice Lumumba, the famous sort of revolutionary. And I think there's a feeling in Congo of the West has betrayed us. It always does. It always sells us out. It's supporting this small little, country that keeps invading us and stealing our minerals. And if that's the way they're going to play it, let's cozy up to Russia. And I think that's one of the reasons why people need to really worry, because I know we're not in the Cold War, but Russia is interfering in Africa again. And it wouldn't be particularly helpful if we saw those kind of games being played in the Great Lakes of Africa.
I think we're in the middle of a Cold War. I think on the verge of a hot war. Let's take a question from Hilary Matthews.
Hello. I just wondered if you know anything about the working and living conditions of the people who work in all these mines. One hears the most horrendous stories about poverty, and they're working for a pittance. And do you know anything about whether the global corporations who buy these minerals care about the working conditions, or do the governments care, the Rwandan or the Congolese government care about the people who are doing all this work for nothing, I think?
Well, you've probably seen some of the same videos as I have, where you see what are called artisanal miners, working sort of knee deep in water, and many of them are children. And sometimes you see them, the sort of hand dug kind of tunnels that they're disappearing into, and then a sudden collapse, and you don't know what's happened to the people who were inside that tunnel. So I think there's an awful lot of that, but I think the conditions in the mines, it depends where you go. Traditionally, a lot of Congolese minerals came not so much from the east of Congo, they came from Shaba, or Katanga, as it's also known. And that was where the whole mining industry of Congo was based, in Lubumbashi and Bujimai. And there you tend to have, heavy investments by companies, outside, foreign investors. And I think there is an attempt to establish basic sort of principles of decent employment and working hours and take care of the workers. But I think my impression is in Eastern Congo, there's very little of that, because, we're talking about an area where famously there are between 150 and 200 different militia groups. And so, big mining companies, in those circumstances, it's very hard for them to operate and start setting all sorts of rules and regulations about how the population, the labouring force is treated. And that's been true now for decades, that situation. So yeah, I think conditions are pretty ghastly.
We'll take next question from Lois Towart, who's in Australia.
One of the things you've got in the East Congo is the volcanic chain, including Nyiragongo, which is a lovely big volcano that I would love to at some stage visit. However, whenever these erupt, they tend to be incredibly disruptive to the surrounding population, including Goma, etc. How much do these volcanic eruptions also play into just the overall mayhem and the difficulty of operating in that general region?
I've got a follow-up question to that as well.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that is all of those volcanoes are live, and they do occasionally erupt. And I'm trying to think when it last happened, but there was an occasion, certainly in the last 10 years, where one of them erupted, and there was, lava, liquid lava, running through the streets of Goma, and there it stayed, because it then hardened. So yeah, it is a very seismically active area. At the moment, there's no sign of that. I think they sort of bubble up, and people sort of have some warning when it's coming. There are all sorts of myths that surround Lake Kivu, partly because of that seismic activity. There's supposed to be a spell that is cast around the lake, and that, at periodic intervals, people just sort of get sucked into the lake, or swimmers disappear. It has a kind of magical property, and I think a lot of that is actually connected with the volcano, that, that water has probably got all sorts of interesting minerals and bubbling, sort of springs that come up through it. But at the moment it's quiet anyway.
Could you talk a bit more, Michela, about the area? And it's an area that's got significant refugee populations. Because of the conflict, there's an enormous amount of poverty, despite the enormous agricultural riches and mineral riches. It's an area that's been very hard hit anyway.
Yes, it's been very hard hit. I remember the first time I went there was in 1994, before the genocide. It was my first time in Congo, and I think I'm correct in saying there's a time change when you go from Kinshasa. You actually have to get off at Goma, and you have to change your watch, because it's either 1 hour or 2 hour time. It's such are the distances. It's stunningly beautiful, absolutely stunning. I've never been in a place as beautiful as that part of the world. You have this sort of layer upon layer of hills and sort of volcanic mountains, sort of, disappearing off into the distance. Very, very green, very fertile, and then these blue lakes. I think that was always an irony for me, because I went there and then sort of stayed to report on the final days of the genocide later on. And then there was a cholera outbreak in these enormous refugee camps that formed afterwards as people fled the genocide in Rwanda. And, the amount of death that area has seen is absolutely extraordinary, and yet it's all in this extraordinarily beautiful setting. And it somehow makes it all the more poignant. I mentioned earlier that I was in Bukavu with the last time I went there. I was accompanying John Le Carre, also known as David Cornwall. His real name is David Cornwall, on a trip, a research trip he was doing for his book, The Mission Song. And it's set in Bukavu. It's not one of his best known works, but he needed a research, and he approached me and said, would I go with him? And I organized a whole trip there with him. And we stayed in Bukavu for a week. We went in via Rwanda and stayed in this absolutely stunning hotel called the Orchid Hotel in Bukavu, which has this view across these sort of plunging mountains into this blue sea. And we would sort of have whiskies on the terrace and watch these pirogues, the canoes, sort of languidly crossing the waters, and then go out and do a few interviews every day. And the whole hotel, it's called the Orchid Hotel because it's just full of orchids. So we were surrounded with flowers and the scent of orchids. And it was so beautiful. And yet even then, there were all sorts of things going wrong. There were riots in the city, and there was a sort of flash flood while we were there that sort of drowned some people, and, the sweeping cars down in front of us. And I think it's always that juxtaposition of violence and beauty that is sadly very Congolese.
You are going to be with us in June when we're next door in Uganda. And what a contrast, a country that's really very politically settled, that's seen, quite a bit of conflict in previous decades, but not at the moment by any means. Can you just talk a bit about Uganda's interests there, and also what's going on internally in Uganda? This is a slight tip towards what we're doing, because some of those issues are also about the succession within Uganda. Museveni, who's the leader of Uganda, is very, very old now, and there's the question of who takes over. His son is standing in the wings. So these things come into play a bit also with this.
Yes, well, Uganda has had a history at various periods in its history. Uganda and Rwanda have either been very, very close or at sort of loggerheads with one another. And Museveni, after all, was the head of a rebel movement that recruited Kagame as almost as a young boy. And he's the older man who basically taught Kagame and his fellow Rwandan Tutsis who were living in Uganda how to be rebels. And so there's a sort of avuncular and paternalistic a relationship between them, but also a certain amount of resentment. And relations between the two leaderships are now very tense. And at various periods, Museveni in Uganda has suspected Kagame of plotting to assassinate him, and the same is true the other way around. And each thinks the other is harboring rebels that want to bring down the regime. I think the big question mark at the moment is Museveni has this very wayward and unpredictable son who is the head of the land forces, General Muhoozi, who is an unpredictable character, to put it mildly, and is very close to Kagame. He talks about Kagame being his uncle. And what we've been seeing recently has been a bit of movement at the border between Uganda and Congo since Goma fell, which has made diplomats in the region rather worried that maybe Uganda might be about to join in. And also try and go, if Kagame has got a permanent land grab in mind, and there's a big, we don't know, but that seems to be the way it's looking. The question mark poses itself whether Uganda's going to do something similar, because in the past, in the 1990s, that is what happened.
I do want to, as we wrap up here, there is a sense that the brakes have come off, and we mentioned this previously. The United States is not interested in this. Russia is exerting its influence across Africa. It's now not just conflicts within Africa that have bubbled away. This is happening in Europe. Countries are quite happily walking into each other and taking a slice of land. And it just seems to me, this is just a comment more than a question perhaps, that this is becoming part of a broader trend. And are there any ways of? I know that there's going to be an African summit, I think, taking place in South Africa or somewhere else quite shortly. So there's
going to be a couple of meetings. One of the key ones will be in Dar es Salaam on Saturday. That's an East African meeting, but the question mark is whether Kagame and Felix Tshisekedi, the Congolese president, will they actually even turn up? Because in the past, Tshisekedi has refused to go to those meetings, and Kagame has also refused to go to other meetings under a different aegis. So it's quite possible that neither of them will turn up, and then that would be obviously a failure. I think my own view is that it's time that the West actually unfolded some very direct and rather muscular sanctions against Kagame, because that's the only way I can see this crisis being resolved. And I'm sort of wondering why it hasn't happened already, because it seemed to me that the time for it to happen was already at the beginning of this week, or maybe even last week. And the longer it takes, the less likely it is that they're going to have an impact. So I find that very concerning, because it seems to me that is the only thing that really would have an effect on Kagame. And I don't think you can stop what's happening unless you stop Kagame.
Well, Michela, I think there we must leave it. It's been a very, very good overview of things, a complex but very worrying development. We're very, very grateful to have you there with us, and we're very much looking forward to travelling with you in June in Uganda, where we're going to a much more peaceful place, but one where we can get a perspective on this and of course on Ugandan affairs. So thank you very much indeed for your time.
It's a pleasure, Nicholas. Good to see you all. Good to meet you all.